Hi guys, this is a podcast called Technically Speaking. We are a bunch of scientists and engineers, and we are hoping to talk about scientific topics or topics of interest and have a discussion around them and see how you guys pick up from that in some sort of way. Today's topic is nuclear power going to contribute to tackle climate change? We have on the line, we have Laura, we have Aneeqa, and we have Cara, and myself, Amina, and we are going to see how this discussion goes. So would you guys like to perhaps maybe give you an introduction about yourselves?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. So I worked in the nuclear industry on and off for quite a while now, about 15 or so years. I know quite a lot about nuclear waste and a little bit how nuclear power technology works as well, and generally stuff about the risks associated with it, the benefits of it, and that sort of thing. Aneeqa, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I'm also a researcher in nuclear, but I work on nuclear fusion and I look at more of the materials and engineering side of things.
So I'm Cara. I am an engineer by training, but I've never really worked as an engineer. I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, doing interdisciplinary research. And I did my PhD with the nuclear decommissioning sector. So that's really about the back end of how we're going to clean up things. But my focus really is around the social side of things and social value around the communities and what nuclear energy does for people.
Awesome. Right, so if we take things right to the beginning, shall we go off by how nuclear reactors work and what sort of different technologies are available?
Aneeqa, I think that's one for you.
Well, thanks, guys. So I work in the most futuristic nuclear reactors, so none of the reactors at the moment that we have available for electricity are actually nuclear fusion reactors. So basically, any nuclear reactors producing electricity at the moment are a type of reaction called a fission reaction. So they're fission reactors, and that is essentially where you split atoms apart. Could be different types of atoms, but typically uranium, which is split. And then thanks to good old Einstein and his E=mc² equation, you have a mass difference between the atoms that you're splitting to start with, and then the products that you're left with, and that mass difference is equivalent to energy. So that's basically the energy that's liberated from that reaction in the form of heat, which we use to drive turbines, etc., and produce electricity. So that's kind of a very, very simple way of explaining how a nuclear reactor works. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything. That's a very bare bones description, I know.
Yeah, I came across someone who said that the most basic form of describing how a nuclear reactor works is imagining it as a giant kettle. So basically you heat it up and you produce steam, and then the steam turns into the turbines, and then that effectively produces energy. And the way that you get the heat and stuff, again, can obviously be done by fission or fusion. Fusion is what Aneeqa was talking about.
So I have a possibly really ignorant question, because I know so little about fusion power, but did you say that also drives a turbine, right?
Well, theoretically, if we ever produce a power plant that can actually produce electricity, controversial topic, I know. But yeah, so essentially, I guess it would work in the same way that, yeah, you would generate heat, drive a turbine with steam, etc., and produce it the same way. But I know potentially maybe people are working on more efficient technologies, etc., or secondary applications is a big hot topic at the moment. So not necessarily using the energy liberated to provide electricity, but maybe for other purposes. So a big one at the moment is producing hydrogen. The hydrogen economy is a big buzzword that's floating around at the moment. People want to convert from traditional gas to hydrogen in the transition to a cleaner society. So that could be a potential secondary application we could use for fission or fusion reactors. And other kind of things could be like desalination and stuff like that. So using the heat for other things apart from just electricity is something that we need to think about as well when transitioning to cleaner forms of technology and energy.
Yeah, there's talk about using the steam that's generated to sort of like as district heating, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think could be a pretty cool use of it. So you've got like those cooling loops. You'd have like the secondary cooling loop, I guess, that would somehow interface with a grid of hot water running under the city, I guess, or town, or wherever you are.
I haven't heard of that before. I guess that's a question. Sorry, maybe this is a bit off topic, but fission reactors tend to be in the middle of nowhere in the UK, so district heating wouldn't work as well. Do they imagine that fusion reactors will be closer to people?
I mean, I'm not sure actually. So there's a bit of a, what's the word? Debate, maybe. I think, yeah, debate's the word I'm looking for. So some people are pursuing this, like, kind of the larger the reactor, the more energy you're gonna liberate and the more electricity you can produce. But there's also kind of current work looking at smaller reactors due to new technology that's being developed. They can actually build smaller reactors that in theory could generate the same amount of electricity as larger ones. So it's these new high temperature superconductors that can essentially shrink down the size of your reactor. So that could be really interesting in terms of where fusion reactors could be located in the future.
I think so. Then, in terms of just different types of nuclear energy, that's also the future of fission. They're kind of saying about small modular reactors because, fission technologies over the decades have changed quite a lot. The UK has quite a unique setup for what they have. So they do think going forwards they do plan to continue building fission reactors. But yeah, maybe some of the small modular ones that you said.
Although going back to the point that you guys were saying about being sort of remote, the SMRs are still, the small modular reactors, which are known as SMRs, they're still hoping to be quite remote. They're still going to be sort of, right now, the sort of preliminary planning that they're doing and the areas that they're looking at to sort of corner off for SMR production, they're all still really remote. They're not sort of coming inwards or anything.
Yeah, I think people are still a bit more scared of fission than fusion, so maybe I can't imagine district heating working that well for a fission reactor. People are scared of the radioactivity, politically speaking.
We have Rwayda as well on the line, who I think has a question.
Yes, I have a very basic question since everybody is so knowledgeable on nuclear energy. There's this rumor that nuclear energy is endless, so it will keep on, if you have a reactor, it will keep on generating electricity forever. Is that true?
Who would like to take that?
I can start and people can jump in if they, again, I might butcher this completely, but unfortunately there's no such thing as unlimited energy, even though we often use that phrase, especially in fusion. We're very guilty of that thing. We have limitless energy because the fuels in fusion that we would use are deuterium and tritium, which are kind of isotopes of hydrogen, which you can deuterium you can get from seawater, and the tritium you can get from lithium, which is basically what's in your laptop batteries. So we often throw that phrase about, but in reality, nothing is limitless. So even though the fuel for fusion might be in a great supply, but the other kind of materials you need to build the reactor, how long they last, coping with those extreme conditions in the reactor, those all contribute to the lifetime of the reactor. And then in the fission industry, again, although you liberate huge amounts of fuel, from huge amounts of energy from very small amounts of fuel, especially if you compare to like coal or other fossil fuels, for example, the actual amount of fuel you need is very limited. So, it's a much higher payoff on the fuel side. Again, buildings, they get wear and tear, they break down over time, sometimes from the, damage from the neutrons, heat loads, and just generally getting old, like any old building. But I know Laura and Cara, they've evolved, on the other side, the end of life of nuclear reactors. But I think also equally with that, people are trying to extend lives as well of nuclear reactors and keep them going for longer, to make them more worthwhile too. Laura and Cara, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I'm trying to think how long a lot of the reactors have been around for. I want to say some of them like 50
they say
years.
60 years.
Yeah.
60 years. They're trying to go for 60 years now. So now everything that's coming out, they're typically saying about 60 years.
Yeah, which is a pretty long time for a piece of technology that's being like irradiating itself quite heavily.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing about fission reactors, I'm going to keep stumbling over that word because I keep mixing up fission and fusion because I don't tend to deal with the power side of it. I work well with waste from old technology, and that's a lot doesn't really have those phrases involved. But I think after about sort of a couple of percent burn up from the fuel, so a very small amount of uranium is converted to something else, falling apart. Those fission products start to affect the efficiency of the reactor, so the amount of energy can be liberated falls. The fuel then has to be taken out, and then it can be recycled. So you extract those fission fragments that aren't useful, and you can take the other sort of 94% of uranium or whatever it is and put that into fresh fuel rods, so you can keep recycling it quite often, I think.
Yeah, you can. So you can change the configuration of the reactor quite frequently according to how they're being irradiated and stuff, and so that way you extend its life effectively. And you obviously, but you do obviously have power outages and stuff as with any sort of power supply, where they need to do maintenance and stuff. But the power outages don't seem to be too long, because they kind of know what they're doing and they're kind of maintaining things along the way that alongside the way that they're going. So it's quite efficient, really, I'd say. So the big question here is, if nuclear is great in so many ways, then what's the main problem? Why do environmentalists not like nuclear power? Why do we not have a big sort of backing of, yes, this is the future, let's go, 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 go?
I think that's a really good question. And I think one thing that we should reference in the podcast today is the International Energy, I want to say Authority, IEA. Is it Authority? I think it's Authority.
Agency. Yeah, IAEA.
Not IAEA. It's the other one. I always get them too confused. So IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Agency, but there's also the IEA, which is the National, I want to say International Energy Authority. But let me just Google this as we speak. But they've had a flagship report end of last year, in which they've kind of modeled its agency, its International Energy Agency. But yeah, so they've got this World Energy Outlook, and they've got these kind of goals and a sustainable development scenario. And within that, going forward, of course, renewables will play a part, but they've actually said within that nuclear has to play a part in that. And I think last week also Bill Gates said something about this, that nuclear really has a key role to play if we are to meet those kind of climate change goals. Because although the renewable technology is there and it's great, it still has its issues. You know, if it's not windy on certain days, if it's not sunny on certain days, you don't have a stable baseload supply of energy, and our world needs energy, whether we like it or not. So nuclear really does have a key role to play in that. But I think obviously it does have this issue with public perception, and maybe that goes to the social value side as well, Cara. I don't know if you want to add anything on the social side.
I could wax lyrical about this for a long time. I think there's a lot to say about the perception of nuclear. A lot of it is to do with risk perception. I think if you go back and look at the history of it a little bit, when nuclear energy was kind of first being like shown around the world, started off really in England, of how great it was, and they kind of said this is going to be energy that's so cheap, we'll have so much we wouldn't even know what to do with it, and it's going to completely revolutionize society. But then, of course, along with that came a lot of the atomic weapon issues, and then there was things happening, like in the bombs going off in different countries around the world, and that basically just completely conflated what everyone's perception of it was. So my accent is very Irish. I'm from Ireland, where we don't have nuclear power stations. But what we had in the papers a lot whenever I was growing up was that Sellafield sits in the west coast of England, which is across the sea from Ireland, and people in Ireland constantly talked about how there was higher illness rates on the beaches along the east coast of Ireland, because they said the energy was coming over, and it was this very much like fear thing. So I've been on that side of the fear of it. Maybe that was perpetuated further by weird relations between Ireland and England, because there was always another agenda coming along. So it is very much these stories that get told around what people think about nuclear. But I think a lot of it is to do with perception. And I think I used to be kind of willfully ignorant to what nuclear energy potential had. But I think now I've come around to the idea that, yeah, it kind of needs to play a role in the future going forwards. And some stats that go along with that, I think, is that nuclear is an incredibly regulated industry. And so people are very aware of what the dangers are and what the risk of the waste is. But actually, if you compare it to coal, if you compare it to other fossil fuels, like actually the radiation of waste is considerably less. It's far more controlled. It's technically cleaner in ways. If you compare it to petrochemical industries, again, it's kind of like, there's a lot worse things going on in the world. So not saying that that makes nuclear okay, but I'm just saying, that we have to kind of reframe what the discussion is. And I think a really great example of that is one of the founders of Greenpeace, who are notorious for being very anti-nuclear. He now is no longer with Greenpeace, and he is now an advocate for nuclear energy, because he realized that when you look at the science in a different way, it kind of can be seen very differently. So I think a lot of it is to do with around the messaging of what radioactivity really is, and a lot of the fear. So again, another story from my childhood is I'm a huge fan of The Simpsons, where nuclear energy plays a big role, and that would probably be like my biggest education as a kid of what nuclear energy was. And you see the three-eyed fish all the time, right? That's just kind of what the pop culture references make. Or Spider-Man, like people are kind of told that radioactivity is really dangerous, and that's kind of constantly what you're told. How many people have those stories around coal? Probably not many. So that's a kind of a roundabout way of just kind of talking about how it's a strange industry that there's lots of myths around.
I think your point of view is really good. Like, so I'm from a safety background, and I have to say that I was so surprised when I joined the safety side. I'm originally a materials person, so I wasn't really sort of aware of all of these things. But when I came into safety, the amount of precautions they're having to take on every little thing is, sometimes you would stop in your tracks and you would say, my God, this is just too pessimistic. This is just not, this would never happen. If you look into the history of nuclear accidents and stuff, the amount of fatalities that we've had in the nuclear industry are far less than what the fatalities have been in the coal or even in the oil and gas industry. Like, it's just, the fatalities comparison is just, it's ridiculous how much negativity that we have around the nuclear industry in comparison to the other ones. If you look at all the major accidents that we've had in the nuclear industry, like sort of Fukushima, everyone sort of says that it was a big thing, but actually it was just a hydrogen explosion. If you sort of go into it and look into the details of it, so the safety around the nuclear industries, it's just inherently built into it so much that actually to have sort of like a nuclear accident is it's quite slim.
I think actually people who work in nuclear, people who are now realizing that the messaging needs to change slightly, is that they've realized that this constant like, oh, but it's safe, we can prove to you it's safe, has it made people think like, is it safe really? Like, why are you trying to reassure us so much? And there is definitely something around that they need to kind of rethink how they're doing that message.
That's too much.
Yeah.
I think that I agree with that. I think you've both put that really well. And the thing is, like, there's no such thing as like a clean resource or anything that's guilt-free or without any issues at some point during the supply chain. Like even solar panels, for example, the kind of heavy metals and toxic chemicals associated with that or disposing of that, I think is pretty horrendous, actually, but no one really seems to go on about that. I'm not saying we shouldn't have solar panels, but it's just that, as you say, it's a perception thing, that there's no such thing as, completely clean or completely perfect utopian energy source. There just isn't. We just have to make the best of what we have, basically.
Yeah, I think the correct information needs to be out there for people to make an informed decision, right? And I think it's very difficult to take some information in when like feelings and social consciousness and stuff like that gets in the way. Because I think, as Cara pointed out, there are all these ideas about the nuclear industry that persist in the media and in society that kind of skew the conversation quite a lot.
I was anti-nuclear as a kid. So I think I think it's pretty common because I was one of these like Greenpeace hippie kids, and I was like, no nuclear, but somehow ended up going into nuclear eventually. Somewhere along the line, something changed and clicked.
definitely
yeah.
think it's all about perception. Like the amount of STEM events I've done, and I've had people, or even kids as well as parents, come up and be like, what is it with this industry? Why do you work in this industry? It's not safe. And you have like a 10-minute conversation with them and they walk away and think, actually, no, that's really good. So it is just about a matter of just getting out there, speaking to people, addressing their concerns. And hopefully podcasts like this will help that. So can I also please ask one sort of big question? So nuclear power also produces a lot of waste. We can't deny that. It's great. It's really a sort of, like we've spoken about, fatalities and inherent safety being built into it and those kind of things. It's great in some aspects, but then it also does produce nuclear waste. So what are your thoughts on that? How is the risk of the nuclear power sort of versus the nuclear waste that it produces, and how we manage with it, and what it means for the generations to come?
Well, the amount of waste that's produced from the industry is actually quite small in terms of volume compared to just like the waste that's generated in the UK in a year. Like household waste volumes are far bigger than nuclear waste volumes annually.
Yeah.
Admittedly, there are possibly more risks associated with waste in the nuclear industry, but it depends on exactly what that waste is. Not all waste is radioactive from nuclear, and there are different levels of radioactivity as well. I think someone did some maths on this, and the amount of the high level waste, so the stuff that we class as really dangerous that were produced for the lifetime of our person, is like a disc that would fit into my hand. I wouldn't necessarily pick it up because it'd be really radioactive, but that gives you an idea of the sort of waste volumes that are generated. And in terms of managing it, I mean, the nuclear industry in the UK has been around for decades, since like the 50s, if not earlier. And so we've got all this experience of how to manage the waste and how to do it safely. The big question is how to dispose of it, I think. And that's something that Radioactive Waste Management Limited is currently looking at. So the idea is that a host community will come forward to volunteer to host a repository. So the waste will be buried underground. It'll be far away from people where it can't be interacted with by us. And it will be sealed off from the environment, and then we can not have to think about it so much. I don't know if Aneeqa and Cara have got anything to add to that.
Well, I think you kind of covered both things, really, talking about it, that back end of the waste. I think, so a couple of points to make. I guess one is really around, most countries do it quite well. They have got things saved quite well. In the US, they have things in big concrete tankers sitting in car parks, but they are generally kind of, keeping an eye on it. But there are stories definitely where some countries where there's illegal waste management that happens, and I think things have been turning up on the beaches of, is it Sudan? Like these big kind of like big canisters full of nuclear waste, so there is definitely challenges around this. It's not being managed well, but it's in comparison to the coal industry, which pumps out like who knows how much like volumes of coal waste into the air all the time. But I think in terms of the whole supply chain of waste, I think so sometimes there is arguments around, if you look at the whole life cycle cost modeling of like building a plant, like the amount of cement or concrete that goes into it is a lot. But a really forgotten part of the supply chain is actually uranium mining. And I think that's definitely where there's actually some challenges around waste management that people maybe don't consider enough, from what the limited amount that I know of it. I think a lot of it comes from countries where maybe, or communities where they aren't protected enough. I know a lot of it comes from Native American land in the US or Kazakhstan, and is it somewhere in Africa, Nigeria possibly, and Australia. So Australia maybe manages slightly better. Australia and Canada. So yeah, in these places, depending on how well those communities are supported and regulated, there maybe isn't so many challenges, but there is definitely some communities who've been left with a long-standing problem where their mines have been left essentially open and they are being exposed to natural radiation, so kind of maybe not as immediately dangerous, but it is definitely an issue that I think is not discussed enough in the UK.
Right. So the talk at the minute is that we won't necessarily reprocess our waste at the minute to extract the useful uranium, because uranium mining is so cheaper to buy it from somewhere else than it is to recycle it. Do you think that might change if the mining practices change?
Yeah, but kind of Aneeqa, you hinted at before, talking about solar panels. If you look at the electronics industry generally, I think where a lot of valuable materials come from, they don't have to care about the social practices around their mines. So I'm not sure how quickly uranium will become more expensive, unfortunately. Even if it is in Canada and Australia, where the industries might be a bit more regulated, they aren't really when it comes to mining things. So I don't know actually, but I'm a bit cynical about that possibly.
Maybe if that came under regular sort of nuclear regulations and stuff, perhaps it would sort of get picked up, because as far as everything else is concerned for nuclear, it's so heavily regulated that sometimes it seems a bit excessive. So maybe the angle should be to include the mining all the way down to decommissioning, rather than just sort of looking at the lifeline of producing the energy all the way up into decommissioning, because that's what we essentially we look at right now. We don't really sort of include the mining and stuff into it.
Yeah, I agree actually. I'm not sure why. I thought because I worked in decommissioning, I didn't really meet people who worked in that side of it, but maybe they do. Maybe it's not included generally. Don't know.
Yeah. Right. So I think that's been a very useful discussion. And if we hope to post this online and have a discussion around this, maybe we can have some questions and we can address some questions some more. And I hope that you enjoyed this discussion, and we shall see you soon.